Okay, welcome to our second video in the How to Play Chess series. This is the first video where we'll talk about the movements of a specific chessman, in this case the pawn. And a little bit about names. All of the other chessmen can be correctly called chess pieces. While pawns are often called pieces, they technically are not pieces, they are simply pawns. The pawns and the pieces together form the chessmen. And I actually only learned this distinction a few months ago, and I'm trying to break a lifetime habit of calling all the chessmen pieces. So you may hear me mess up every now and then, and I'll try to correct myself. But pawns are pawns, pieces are pieces, and together they form the chessmen. All right, so back to the pawn itself. While pawns are the weakest chessmen out there on the board, they are by no means unimportant. In fact, pawns can be some of the most important chessmen on the board. One of their important jobs is forming lines of protection for the pieces. They also have a special ability that the pieces do not. They can be promoted if they reach the farthest rank from their starting position. More about that later. The point here is that young players often carelessly throw away pawns and do not think through pawn positioning. Don't do this. Pawns are important. With that said, pawns are very weird. They have some of the weirdest rules associated with them, so let's go over those rules now. I'm just going to speak through these first, and then I've loaded some moves into this analysis board to show you how those different rules work. The first rule is pawns only advance. They can never go backwards. This is different from every other chessman. The other pieces can move backwards while pawns can only move forward. The second rule, pawns move forward one square at a time only, unless, and here's our third rule, pawns taking their very first move can actually move forward 2 squares. They can move 1 or 2, they can choose. So pawns on their first move can move either 1 or 2 squares. After that, pawns always move only 1 forward. And now for our fourth rule, pawns capture diagonally 1 ahead. So here's another difference that pawns have from the pieces. Unlike every one of the pieces, pawns advance and capture differently. So while they advance directly ahead, they capture diagonally in front of them. Fifth rule, pawns can capture in a very unique way called en passant. And this is one pawn capturing another pawn. But this is so tricky, I'm going to wait till we get to the board to go over it. Finally, the sixth rule, as mentioned above, pawns promote to any piece except a king if they reach the last rank. Okay, let's see how these rules look on the board. Okay, let's first look at white's e pawn. Since that pawn hasn't moved yet, it can move 1 or 2 spaces. Let's have it move 2 spaces forward. All right, and black's e-pawn can respond in the same way. It can move 1 or 2 spaces because this pawn has not moved at all. Again, let's have it move 2 spaces. Now this opening, e4 followed by e5, is one of the most common chess openings. A particular peculiarity of pawns is that they can block each other. Note that white's e-pawn cannot advance forward because it's being blocked by black's e-pawn, and the same is true of black's e-pawn. Because pawns do not capture in a forward motion, they are blocking each other. But this formation is powerful because white's pawn is actually guarding both d5 and f5, and black's pawn is guarding both d4 and f4. So we can already see that both white and black are vying for control of the center of this board, which is a good long-term strategy. All right, so enough about strategy. Let's look at more of the rules. So let's just continue some movements here of pawns. Let's say we have the movement c4, followed by black's move of b5. Now you'll see that white's pawn on c can move either 1 forward or he can capture the pawn on b5. He can do either, or white could do neither and do another move. There's no rule that requires you to take a chessman when you're playing chess. So let's just go ahead and capture, and you'll see that now white's C pawn is on the B file. So white's B file has 2 pawns on it, which is fine to do technically. It's not desired. Okay, and now we're going to see this en passant rule. So remember in our first video I talked about how the chess rules have evolved over time. Well, it's only been in the past 200 years or so that pawns could move 2 on their first go. It used to be that pawns could only ever move 1. When they started allowing pawns to move 2, there was a concern that pawns would be able to skip by other pawns. So let's look at black's C pawn. Note the circles on the board indicating that the legal moves for black are either the C6 square or the C5 square. And note that if black were to move to this C5 square, white now is unable to capture it because it has moved past the diagonal where white can capture. And this is where this very strange move called en passant comes into play. En passant is a French word and it means in passing. So this rule was developed so that pawns would have the opportunity to capture another pawn when it's taking that first 2 square move, just like it would have had the opportunity to capture it if the 2 move rule wasn't available. So white's B pawn, now you can see with the 2 highlighted squares with the colors, now can either move 1 forward or can capture diagonally as if this pawn was still on the C6 square, even though it's on the C5 square. So what that looks like is white simply places his pawn on the C6 square and captures the pawn that was on C5, and that pawn is gone now. Now, one thing about en passant, should white choose to not capture this pawn, let's say, for example, white played G3 here, and let's say black plays H6. Notice now the highlights only cover the square directly in front of this white B5 pawn because the option for an en passant capture is taken away. That only occurs immediately after this 2 move of a pawn on an adjacent square. So I hope that makes sense. If not, you can ask me and I can demonstrate it more when we actually get in clubs. So let me show you this again. So this pawn, if it only could move 1 square, obviously we could capture it. Once we made the rule where pawns could move 2 squares, we wanted these pawns that were adjacent to it to still have the option to capture, and we do that with the en passant rule, and it captures it moving forward and diagonally while this pawn goes away. That's en passant, one of the hardest moves to learn, so we'll talk about it more. Alright, so the last thing I want to demonstrate is how a pawn promotes, and I'm going to just move some pieces here out of the way. This is not going to be good strategy, but just so you can see how this works. So we're just going to make a move for black, again, H6. Now we're going to capture with white CX D7 plus, and the plus just indicates, as we'll learn in the future, that because pawns capture diagonally, this king is actually in danger here. So again, we're just doing this to show promotion. We're not showing any tactics, so we're just going to move the king out of the way. And now we're going to let the pawn capture this bishop to its left. It could also go forward if the queen had moved, so I'll back up and show you that variant as well. So we're going to capture this bishop, and the board is immediately going to give this option of changing this pawn into a queen, a knight, a rook, or a bishop, we will almost always choose queen. There will only be very limited circumstances where we want to choose something else, and normally that's a knight because we want that knight's uh, movement to capture another place, or if we want to avoid stalemate, we might choose a rook or a bishop. But that's very advanced. We almost always choose a queen, so we'll choose a queen here, and now that pawn becomes a queen, and the queen's one of the most valuable pieces. All right, I just want to back up and show you that this can happen by simply going forward. So I'll make a different move with white. Now I'll advance this queen out of there, and you'll see that the pawn can move forward and also promote. It doesn't have to be moving diagonally to capture. Okay, so those are all the rules with pawns. I do want to suggest a simple drill that you can do at home with a sibling or a parent. And I'm going to set up the board in a non-standard way for chess, but it's a pawn drill that kind of can help you learn how to move pawns around. So what we're going to do is basically leave only pawns on the board and take off all the pieces, and then we're going to move the pawns just as pawns. And so we're going to see we can move one or two, and the goal here is to win by one of three things: either advancing a pawn to this last rank, capturing all your opponent's pawns, or making your opponent have no legal move while you still have a legal move. If both you and your opponent run out of moves at the same time, then we'll call that a draw or a stalemate. So you'll just advance these pawns by the pawn rules, and you'll capture, and you'll try to eventually get a pawn into that back rank, or you can try to get a pawn, capture all your opponent's pawns, or you can take away all your opponent's legal moves while you still have legal moves. So here in this quick demonstration, I just showed you that white would win here because white got a pawn to that back rank first. So this is a good beginning drill for pawns. All right, our next video we'll talk about the king and the queen and how they move.